we don't slow down, because when we slow down, we start to feel. And that can be scary for individuals.
Of autism, you're high functioning. It's like my eyes are brown, yours are blue, and understanding that it's just a differentiation as opposed to this disorder.
Autistic individuals tend to have comorbid depression or comorbid anxiety or both. Autism is not something you treat, and that's something that I think deters a lot of children, a lot of teens from connecting with mental health professionals. If you know that, okay, I feel unworthy because it's a symptom of my depression, it's almost like saying, well, I have a cough because it's a symptom of my cold. We need to understand why children are becoming more suicidal.
Like with Anthony, he didn't really want to open up to me so much. It was to his peers. That's really powerful.
I'm Neal Tricarico, and my wife, Samara, and I are grateful you're here for this unique podcast experience. We share the story of the loss of our son, Anthony, the movement that has grown out of the unimaginable grief, and the legacy we're building so that no teen ever feels this alone or lost again. We're here to give parents the resources to support their children and the communities around them, because it truly takes a tribe.
The Endurant Show is a testament to post-traumatic growth, the belief that even in the aftermath of deep grief, healing and purpose can emerge. It's a space for truth, connection, and hope, where real conversations around mental health, autism, suicide prevention, and resilience take center stage.
Healing doesn't always start with a diagnosis. It often starts with being heard, and we've created a community just for that.
Each episode, we sit down with teens, parents, experts, and advocates to share honest stories, tools, and resources. Because we believe that awareness is the cure, you don't have to hold your grief alone, and you don't have to run from it.
Through these conversations, we're building a community grounded in understanding, support, and lasting change. If you've ever felt alone, unheard, or unsure of how to keep going, this space is for you.
Today's guest is not only one of the country's leading voices in mental health, she's also someone whose work is reshaping how we understand resilience, identity, and the quiet battles so many of us carry. Dr. Judith is a double board certified psychiatrist. She holds both a medical degree and an MBA, having completed her residency at Columbia University, where she currently leads as chairwoman of the Women in Medicine Board. And she went on to do her fellowship at NYU, where she's taught for over a decade. Her cutting-edge research has earned her national recognition, including United States Congress and House of Representatives Proclamation Award for her advocacy and groundbreaking work in mental health. She's the founder and principal investigator at Manhattan Behavioral Medicine, where she and her team have led over 60 clinical trials, most notably including the trial that helped bring to market the first ever FDA-approved medication for postpartum depression. She is also the author of High Functioning, a groundbreaking book exploring high-functioning depression, where individuals appear outwardly successful while silently struggling with emotional pain. But what makes Dr. Judith the perfect guest for the Endurance Show isn't just her credentials, though those are extraordinary. It's her ability to bridge deep clinical expertise with empathy and storytelling. She brings warmth and clarity to complex topics like masking, burnout, and neurodivergence. Her current research is especially focused on how high-functioning teens and adults often hide their struggles and what that hidden pain does to our minds, our bodies, and our ability to heal. She's also a powerful social advocate. Through her viral videos and active social media presence, she listens to real stories, amplifies marginalized voices, and meets people where they are, online and in real life. This is a conversation about what we carry, what we hide, and how we begin to recover and thrive. Please welcome to the Endurance Show, the brilliant and compassionate Dr. Judith. Well, Dr. Judith, we're so grateful and honored to have you. The Endurant movement was born out of deep and profound loss of our son, Anthony Ant. And we've been pulled through the movement to seek to understand and close the gap between neurodiversity and suicide. And, looking at Anthony, he was the picture of success, 4.6 grade point average, AP classes, entrepreneurial. But inside he was struggling. And we did everything that we could to understand about this black and white thinking and all of the things that came with the diagnosis to support him. And then ultimately, during COVID, he was diagnosed with depression, and not blaming COVID in any way or anything, but that began a journey for us over the course of a couple years to try and help him as he was wrestling with suicidal ideation and struggling with that. And while he was aware of it, and so much so that he wanted to volunteer at suicide prevention, and that was his plan for his senior program, inside he struggled and masked his struggles very much so. And, looking at your book and understanding high functioning and more specifically high functioning depression, it really resonated with us and struck us in a deep and profound way. And we're so grateful to have you. And so we were curious, when someone performs wellness so convincingly like he did, what are the signs we're missing? How can loved ones see beneath the surface? That's at all possible.
Well, I'm really sorry for your loss. And I think sharing is very powerful. It allows you to help others, but it also allows you to feel seen and heard and validated. And I think that's important to vent in that way. Well, the interesting thing about high functioning depression is that you see high functioning depression across all people, no matter what their background is, their age. And sometimes it travels along with, other conditions, like autistic folks can have high functioning depression, folks with ADHD, people with trauma, PTSD. And we all cope with our struggles differently. Some of us shut down. Some of us don't get out of bed, but others, we busy ourselves. We don't slow down, because when we slow down, we start to feel, and that can be scary for individuals. But I do think that one thing that I've seen across the board is something called anhedonia. It's a lack of interest, pleasure, and joy in things. So if you're someone who used to really, really love a certain television show, but then, you're no longer excited by it, and it's different than changing interests. It's like nothing lights you up anymore. Your favorite food doesn't light you up. Seeing your favorite person doesn't light you up. You're just meh, blah. I think that's something that we all should be aware of. And anhedonia, it's not this glaring crisis, right? It's not crying. It's not something like not getting out of bed, but it's almost like an existential crisis. A lack of joy is something that I think we take for granted. We think, oh, well, that's just life. But when people are lacking joy, it's a red flag that something else is happening.
The anhedonia topic resonates with us so much, and in reading about it and hearing you talk about it, I think as unknowingly so, as Anthony progressed and got worse, it was so confusing for us because he was achieving more and more. So it seemed like as he was struggling more, he was also seeking more. And it was confusing for us because, he was very athletic, and then he's starting to do Spartan races and training for them and succeeding in them, and then wanting to do marathons and competing in martial arts. And for us, all these things seem great. He's exercising, he's exerting, he's achieving, he's doing well in school, he's got a job. But one of the things that dawned on me is the concept, which I think is very similar to anhedonia, is this idea of the science of achievement. So achieve, but it's the art of fulfillment. And one of the things that I was trying to help him understand sort of in the last year or so is like, he didn't seem to have the fulfillment from those accomplishments. And then he wanted something bigger. And then when he accomplished it, he seemed less fulfilled, and it was so difficult to watch. And now knowing that there's a name for it, anhedonia, I mean, what could other parents or people that might see that in their child or loved one do?
Well, unfortunately, what happens is that people go based on achievements as a measure of you're doing okay.
Mhm.
That's just how our society is,
Yeah.
Whether or not you're autistic or not. And I really want to change that conversation, because if we continue to go about screening mental health issues like this, then we're going to miss a lot of people, So knowing that you can have everything put together and really excellent on the outside, but also still struggling, knowing that those two things can be true is important.
Mhm.
And so I do want parents to know about that your child could be, talkative, laughing all the time, popular, likable, excellent, and still struggle, right? But we just can't fathom that
Mhm.
because we're so tunnel vision, right? And this is most people, that you can't have both of these things existing in one person. But I do think we do know when someone's struggling with a lack of joy, but we just don't know what to name it, right?
Mhm.
The term anhedonia has been around forever. It's been around since the 1800s. I recently went to a therapy conference and I went around asking therapists, what is anhedonia? And they were like, I don't even know what that is, because we're just not programmed to look at a lack of joy as being an issue. But
Mhm.
if your child is doing well in school and getting great A's and, not causing trouble, but just, doesn't seem as excited, is more withdrawn, doesn't seem to connect with you. These are things that follow your gut, don't ignore it just because the teacher says they're fine, I tell you, deep down when something's off. So follow your gut with regards to your children. You're nodding because you know.
Yeah. It's
But then what? Like, is it
Mhm.
just a conversation? Is it opening the door? Because I found, like, with Anthony, he didn't really want to open up to me so much. It was to his peers.
They don't like to talk to adults.
Mhm.
Teens across the board would rather talk to their peers.
Mhm.
The problem with that is that the peers don't have the answers.
Mhm.
Right.
And there are a lot of organizations now, such as Active Minds. They are really trying to help peers educate their peers. So
Mhm.
they have these acronyms, like I believe one of them is ASK, right?
Mhm.
Teaching adolescents, young adults, how to talk to their peers when their peers are in crisis.
Mhm.
Because you will go to your friends. You're not going to go to your parents.
Right.
You think your parents are going to either put you in therapy,
Mhm.
which they probably should, right?
Mhm.
But, for kids, they see that sometimes as a punishment. Like,
Mhm.
you're going to take away my free time when I already don't have free time.
Right.
So they don't go to their parents. They also, they don't want to disappoint. When you have depression, one of the symptoms of depression is internalizing blame, shame, and guilt.
Mhm.
So you don't want to burden others.
Mhm.
You think that talking to someone that you love is actually going to burden them with your problems. So you're less likely to talk to your parents about it. But your peers, it's different,
Mhm.
because a lot of times teens will talk to each other about these things. And these days, this generation, they talk about mental health
Mhm.
symptoms freely.
Right.
Older generations didn't. You'd be considered weird.
Mhm.
But it's not uncommon to have overhear teenagers talking about, yeah, I have depression, yeah, I have anxiety. Sometimes in my waiting area, if there are patients that show up early and they meet each other, they'll be talking about what they're going through. That did not happen 20 years ago,
Right.
right? So I think the conversation starts even before you start to notice the red flags.
Mhm.
You want to create an environment where, as parents, you share regularly about struggles. And sometimes I'll give families the script of, rather than at the end of the day talking about how was your day and, what did you do in school? With a parent, I'll say, why don't you share something vulnerable, just to start that conversation and normalize this. So, for example, a dad would say, at work today, someone said something to me and it made me feel ashamed, right? Very rarely do you hear dads talking about shame, right?
Mhm.
Mhm.
But I want to normalize that, because
Right.
if children see their fathers talking about shame and embarrassment and being open about that, then they can talk about that,
Mm-hmm.
right? So you want to start modeling the behaviors you want to see in your kids, but start before they start to struggle.
Mm-hmm.
That way, when they do struggle, they will open up about that.
You know, it's interesting that you mentioned that in hindsight, especially we met a psychiatrist doing some really cool work in the Pittsburgh area, Dr. Mayana Gupta, and he spoke to us about just simply removing the D in the diagnosis, like the autism spectrum disorder. You have autism. You're high functioning. It's like my eyes are brown, yours are blue. You know, and understanding that it's just a differentiation as opposed to this disorder. And when we name it a disorder, then something is wrong. Your behavior is wrong, and we have to take you somewhere to have that behavior change so you could be normal. And one of the things that you were just suggesting about like sharing vulnerably, I mean, it's hard not to feel a little bit defensive. I feel like we were reasonably vulnerable, but like maybe connecting more with those aspects of his high functioning, because I have a lot of black and white thinking, like a lot of the things that I saw in him. And you know, I just am struck with maybe sharing with other parents. It's in our house, not in a big way, but it just seemed like he had this thing, and we had to go to a few days a week to the center to do these things, as opposed to making it seem more like part of us. Or
well, it's also, I mean, it's difficult to use certain strategies with kids who have different challenges, right? I didn't know your son, but even within the autism spectrum, everyone's different.
Yeah.
So, for example, I created content a couple of years ago about, how do you notice signs of, autistic behaviors in children? And I think one of my reels, I used the word autism instead of autistic, and I got so many DMs about that, right? Some people didn't like the term autism, but others were okay with it, right? Some people prefer autistic, others like neurodivergent. So just knowing your child and asking them, well, how is it that you identify, right? Because one child may be okay with the term autism, but the other child would be like, no, I don't like it. It sounds like it's a disorder.
Yeah.
And I don't like the fact that it's a disorder. Why don't you embrace that I'm different? And that's okay to be different, that everyone's different. We're all neurodiverse, right?
Yes.
So I think having a conversation with your child about how do they identify? What feels comfortable for them? Is it first person language? Or are they okay with what the medical community uses, So even within just like naming it, there's so many feelings, right? But when you're a parent for the first time. Like, I'm a child psychiatrist and I have a daughter. No one gave me a manual for how to raise a daughter. And I learned this in school, but it's so different when you're raising your own child. So you really don't know. And I think that's why this conversation's important, so that parents listening who don't know can have just a closer idea as to what they can be doing so they have better outcomes, right? But yeah, you're spot on. Like, even if you are vulnerable, it doesn't guarantee the outcome you want to see. But I think learning from your children and sometimes letting them take the lead when it's appropriate can be very, very powerful for them and also for you.
Yeah. And the language that you're using, the conversation that you're having with them, involving them in how, they want to identify. Like you said, there's such power and strength in that.
And even some of the therapies out there are very controversial. There are many people are saying now that when they were younger, as I was growing up, ABA was so harsh, and it just tried to eradicate parts of me that were me. And why would you create a therapy that does that? Like, these are things that were recommended by healthcare professionals, respected hospitals years ago, and now we're like questioning it.
Yeah.
So just even like owning up to that like sometimes the therapies that are recommended are not great for your kid. So when your kid is saying, this is not helpful, listening, and then saying, well, let's let's really think about this. Is this right for my child? Because there's only one you. There's only one me ever, right?
Mhm.
And so we can't just blanket use therapies for a child without thinking about their individual needs. Yes, there are standardized treatments and research, but at the same time, think about your child's individual needs.
Mhm. Do you see just going back to the diagnosing the DSM-5, you've talked about how antiquated that is. Do you see that sort of diagnoses criteria evolving, or where do you think that's going?
Well, I do think that there has to be a bit more nuance, because right now when you look at the DSM and the ICD criteria, it's very vague.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But I think this is one of the cases where it's actually helpful to be vague, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because it's wow, there's only a couple of words, but it's allowing room for different expressions of a condition, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because sometimes, you'll look at one child or one teen who's autistic and they're so different than another. That's why it's called the spectrum, right?
Right.
So I think the actual criteria being so bare boned as it is somewhat helpful, because it's almost like saying, this is a spectrum. So you want to be able to make room for people's individual experiences. But there are different ways to classify. There are these long ways of getting a diagnosis. And even when you go through the long diagnostic criteria and all these days of evaluations, you still aren't any closer.
Mm-hmm.
But that to me, speaks to how individual we are as humans, how every human has a different experience. And, autistic individuals tend to have comorbid depression or comorbid anxiety or both.
Yeah.
Sometimes seizure disorders, sometimes intellectual conditions that are, need support with education. So that's when it gets so complicated. So that's why it's so important to think about your child's needs.
Mm-hmm.
Is this a child that needs more support with their depression, or do they need more help, making friends and keeping friends, and loneliness, I think is a huge problem, right? We know loneliness is a problem for adults, and for children, when they perceive rejection, it's almost like physical pain for them. So loneliness is a problem in this community.
Do you think social media is playing a big part in that? I mean, isolating more with...
Definitely. It's social media can be used to address loneliness, but it can also be used to perpetuate it.
Mm-hmm.
It's one of those things,
Yeah, double-edged sword. Yeah.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
But like everything, we don't know enough about it.
Mm-hmm.
And so having these conversations with your children and prevention is key.
Mm-hmm.
It's such a light bulb moment for me, because as I've studied and prepared and just understand you as this bridge between psychiatry and public understanding, and I'm trying not to, after the fact, judge myself or the system, but I found myself like, well, why is there this spectrum? Anthony is on one end of the spectrum, high functioning, bright. Most of his friends didn't even know that he had this diagnosis. And then you have the other end of the spectrum, where people are nonverbal and things. And I find it so confusing. And yet what you've shared, just sets that all aside, because when you ask them the questions, how do you want to identify? How do you want to connect or resonate with this? That's the only thing that really truly matters as it relates to the human interaction with them. And it's a little bit hard because it's hard not to want to go back, but I just almost feel like for myself, like the moment we got the diagnosis, I didn't just abdicate per se, but I just figured, wow, this is a big deal, especially because he was so young and it seemed so different than my understanding. So I just sort of followed whatever they said. And I think it could be really empowering for parents to have these conversations with their kids, to really talk about where they're at with it. And yet it seems so common sense.
But largely the medical institution, they're not having these conversations. It's being led by the kids. I learned so much from my followers. They'll reach out and say, this is how we like to be addressed. And so we do need to listen to youth and and acknowledge that, sometimes the medical system is really behind. They're great in terms of providing supports, like help with anxiety and depression, but it's important to know that autism is not something you treat, and that's something that I think deters a lot of children, a lot of teens from connecting with mental health professionals, because they feel as if they're we're trying to eradicate a part of them
Mm-hmm.
versus accepting them. And the one thing we know about children is that they need to be accepted.
Mm-hmm.
They need to be loved, right?
Yes.
If you don't accept a child, it is painful for them. They perceive rejection like physical pain.
Mm-hmm.
So you want to tell your children, I accept you. And, you have challenges. We all have challenges. I'm going to support you. And I love you no matter what, And how do you want me to name this, your experience?
Mm-hmm.
How do you want me to address this? And listen to them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really powerful. And also what you were saying about modeling, and you touched a little bit on how we're all neurodiverse to some degree, right? I mean, we all have our unique expression.
Mm-hmm.
So perhaps owning and being vulnerable into our own neurodiversity, it invites them to be okay with theirs.
Yeah, for sure. Once I worked with this family, and I was diagnosing the child with ADHD, and when the child got the diagnosis, it was such a relief, because they were like, I know I'm smart, but sometimes my brain doesn't work. And I had to explain to the family, like, IQ is completely different than ADHD. Mm-hmm. You can be a genius. In fact, I've worked with legit geniuses who also had ADHD, right? Mm-hmm. And it doesn't mean that you're not intelligent. You just have challenges with like focusing and organizing. And then I remember a month later, the mom reached out and she goes, I think I have ADHD. She was like, I learned so much from this process that like all my life I've been dealing with this. And I was like, oh, I'm not smart, but I know I'm smart. And I had ADHD. And, thank goodness that I brought my child, because now I can get the support that I need, So sometimes as a parent, you learn so much just by going through this process with your child.
Mm-hmm.
That's an interesting point, and one that I hadn't really thought about for today, but is this idea of prevalence. I see so much in Anthony, and then and now after the fact, like I wonder if like he got it from me, or like I have so many of those tendencies, and the world seems like, oh, this autism is like, we have to solve it, we have to cure it. There's so much more, but it really seems that it's more of a prevalence situation, meaning that more people are getting diagnosed. They're aware that there's something going on. Maybe I should look into it. I'm curious if you have any thoughts about that.
I do think that there's more awareness, and people are getting diagnosed, I think, more because of the awareness.
Mm-hmm.
And when you think about history and you look at, I love looking back at history.
Yeah.
And sometimes you see these cases of children being like institutionalized, and you realize that was, an autistic child being punished for being them,
Mm-hmm.
So we've come a long way. And so I think it's important to name that we're getting diagnosed because there's more information, more awareness, and less stigma.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
And that's the reality of it. There's a lot of self-diagnoses. Some of it is wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes people are over-diagnosing themselves, incorrectly. But for the large part, I think there is more awareness. And when we accept people and differences, that's important. I think when we, even the term high functioning, when I first started talking about high functioning depression, I got a lot of people reaching out to me and saying, we don't like the term high functioning autism. And I had to tell them, I was like, I'm not referring to autism.
Yeah.
This is people with depression who mask their depression, and they don't process their pain. They cope by busying themselves. And I said, people with high functioning depression can be autistic, but they can also be people who don't have autism, who, have anxiety, who, have trauma. I'm not talking about autistic individuals here, but that, again, to show you how people have very strong feelings about this. So, I do believe that, the awareness is increasing, and that's a good thing. But I do think there needs to be more awareness around acceptance
Mhm.
and supporting people. There's this incorrect notion that autistic people don't want to be around others, that they are antisocial. And that's not even the correct term.
Yeah.
Antisocial doesn't even mean that, but that's
Right.
like, slang.
Right.
That they're fine on their own. But it's the opposite.
Yeah.
Everyone needs connection.
Mhm.
But connection for one autistic individual is going to look different than connection for another,
Yeah.
right? So acknowledging that, we all need each other. We all need connection. But figuring out how to connect in ways that feel comfortable,
Mhm.
that don't cause even more distress.
Mhm.
I'm so glad that you shared that because, at Anthony's celebration of life, I spoke about his legacy of love and connection, and Anthony craved connection. Again, from the outside, it seemed like he had so many friends, buddies and girlfriends, and was doing stuff, but constantly he wanted to be out, and it seemed that it was that connection that he craved. And I don't think we realized how hard he was masking to fit in that. And you mentioned masking, and I really, in your book, High Functioning, you describe masking as silent performance that becomes second nature for high achievers. I mean, what does that actually look like in everyday life? And what's the cost of keeping that performance up?
Well, many people with high functioning depression feel as if they're only worthy if they can have this role, right? That they're only lovable if they maintain a role. And so after a while, they don't even enjoy the role anymore. They just don't want to stop doing it because that's how they, obtain love. And it's not true, because if you ask the people in their lives if, they'd stop loving you if you didn't have this role, they'd say no. But with depression, one of the symptoms is internalized blame, shame, and guilt. And knowing that that's a symptom is something that I think we need to educate, everyone about in terms of depression. If you know that, okay, I feel unworthy because it's a symptom of my depression, it's almost like saying, well, I have a cough because it's a symptom of my cold, right? So having that language and awareness around depression is important, because then if the person knows, okay, I feel unworthy and shameful if I ask for help, or guilty if I ask for help, because those are all symptoms of depression. If I know that, then I will ask for help, right? I won't let the symptom of my depression prevent me from getting the help and the connection that I need. But I think most people don't know that, right? And so having those conversations around when you start to feel ashamed and you feel as if you don't deserve connection, that's a sign of your depression getting worse, right? And then as families, when you know that the person's withdrawing, know that it's because of that, right? Likely because of that. They don't want to burden you. Sometimes you just say it, like, you're not burdening me. You're not burdening your friends. A lot of times when that person shifts their behavior, so rather than staying in, rather than isolating, they are around people, that actually is powerful enough to help them to see that, oh, that was a thought that wasn't rooted in anything, real. That was the depression talking, right? And they see that being out and connecting with others actually does help, right? So being aware of that symptom is important.
I'm curious, as you work with people and to the extent that this applies to teens, since that's our focus to a certain extent. I mean, when you find that in a teen or someone that, they're achieving, but they're not having that fulfillment, and what you just shared is really helpful as well. I'm curious, do you find that also then they find that the thing that they're achieving, they no longer, they'll let go of, or they're finding how to find fulfillment in the thing they're achieving? Because I guess, like for Anthony, it seemed like he was seeking in some way, but is it, if you're depressed, then no matter what you seek, you may not find fulfillment? Or do you find sometimes those things that you're achieving maybe aren't fulfilling?
I think so. It depends. Sometimes I've seen, people feel as if they're empty. They start to feel as if, well, what's the point? And then and everyone's different. They'll start to have this inner narrative of, well, nothing matters in life because I'm doing these things and I'm not feeling better. And is it going to really change anything? And that's when that hopelessness starts to come in. It becomes very difficult And with suicide, it's just one of those things that we don't understand. I wish I could say I did. I wish I could prevent it, and me alongside other mental health professionals.
Right.
But what we know is that, it's that burden. They feel as if they're a burden, so they're not going to open up. And that's why I think it's important to remind people that they're not a burden, right? This is where the education comes in, like knowing that people who are hopeless feel like a burden. You have to sometimes say it. You're not a burden. Like, we need you, And then doing things that are important, like being in nature. Nature does something to the brain. It's this reminder that, wow, like I am here for a reason. Like, with the chances of me existing in this universe are so small. So I must be here for a reason. Look at this incredible forest. Look at this beautiful beach, So being out in nature, going on these walks, sometimes can be very powerful for people who are hopeless. It's just that reminder that they're here for a reason. For others, it's connection with animals. A lot of my patients who have been hopeless in the past have found that being around animals and connecting with not human beings, but beings that are not human, who need you, who look forward to seeing you, that allows them to keep going. If anybody has a dog, when your dog sees you, there's nothing like that, So, sometimes that can be very powerful.
Yeah. So finding a certain type of energy that maybe rejuvenates or shifts the hopelessness into a sense of belonging or I'm needed. I matter. Something that's larger than you. Right. Because with people who tend to intellectualize, like people who are like on the genius spectrum, they sometimes think in a very regimented way. Like, okay, I've done this, I've done that, I've done that, I've done this, I've done that, and I'm still here. And then they keep doing it. And, OCD does travel a lot with autism as well, right? So, if you keep going down that and you figure it out and you're like, well, I'm just going to end up here. You go into this like default mode, right? But powerful things like connecting with nature, connecting with, an animal that loves you unconditionally, those are things that you can't explain, So it's larger than you. It's almost like when people have those spiritual awakenings, when they find their faith or whatever it is. You can't quantify it, right? But it just does something to you. So I think sometimes that can be very powerful, but everyone's different. I do think that once you get into a place where you're so hopeless, it's very challenging to get out of that. And that's where you do need help. You need teams. You sometimes need to remove the person from the situation and put them in a place where they're safe, where they can't harm themselves.
That's interesting about the OCD traveling. I mean, I don't know, but it did seem like, because Anthony was so high functioning and high brightness, that it was so intellectualized for him. I mean, when I was trying to unlock fulfillment or celebration, I'm like, oh, this is a big deal. You were third in a larger age group for this Spartan race. I mean, let's go celebrate. Let's go do something, And he's like, oh, Dad, you're extrinsically motivated and I'm intrinsically motivated. Like, it's enough that I did it. And I just really wrestled with that. And so, your work on high functioning depression, you introduced those 5 V's for reclaiming joy. And I would just can you walk us through that framework? Especially, I mean, as it maybe relates to teens, is it something they could learn and think about as a preemptive kind of framework, or how might it fit in?
Well, I mean, just to go back to your point about Anthony having that, right, like constantly being in this regimented kind of frame of mind, right? I think we do have to acknowledge that, that is a part of being an autistic individual, right? And when you're autistic and you have depression and you have anxiety and you have, other things that you're dealing with, you're going to have a higher risk of suicide. And that's where we need more research. Like, we really need to understand this. We don't know. We just don't have that information. We're not studying it. We're not working with kids the way we need to. So, I just want to highlight that it's going to be more challenging, So if you're listening to this and you're getting tips for your child who is autistic and your child who isn't, know that those challenges are real, right? It's going to be there are going to be more obstacles, and there's not enough research in that area. But with regards to child mental health, when I look at positive psychology and the 5 V's, I tried to make it very simple. And I thought the number 5 was a number that I see across the globe. Like most of us have 5 fingers. And I wanted something that was easy to remember, but also rooted in science. And so the first is validation. So validation is the equivalent of turning the light on and knowing what you're dealing with. Naming your emotions is important. Many folks with depression and who are neurodivergent and who are autistic have a challenge with this. It's called alexithymia. They often don't know how they're feeling, right? And it's important. It's not just like granola-y to name how you feel. It's important because when we don't know how we feel, we're uncertain. So many times clients will come in and they'll say, I'm so angry. And that's why I yelled. And that's why I, threw something. And then when we get to the bottom of it, it wasn't anger at all. They were actually very, very anxious. And their nerves got the best of them. They were very, very worried. So naming how you feel is important because then you know what's the root of it and you know what to do next. Your intervention for anxiety is going to be very different than your intervention for anger. But if you don't know it, it's as if you're walking in the dark. And I use this analogy of if you're in a very dark room and you hear a loud crash and you can't see what it is, many of us would start screaming or running or start swinging. But if you turn the light on and you saw that it was a lamp that fell, then you feel more calm. You're like, oh, I'm safe. And that's why naming emotions is important. So even with my youngest clients, my smallest neurodivergent client, I'll have a face sheet out and I'll teach them about emotions. And I have that face sheet in my book too, right? So you can name your emotions appropriately because when you name it and you're like, oh, I was actually really tired. So I needed to rest, right? And why didn't I rest? Because I was up playing video games. Or, I was actually hangry, I wasn't angry, I was hungry. And that made me angry, So all of these things are important. So validation is important. And that's why having those conversations around the dinner table and showing that in our family, we talk about our emotions. We don't always want to, but we're doing this so that we can name how we feel. Because when we name how we feel, then we know what to do about it. When you have someone with a high IQ, you can do that. But people who are nonverbal, it's more difficult. So that's why we use a lot of the faces, the imagery, because that allows you to point. And maybe over time, that child will eventually start to be more verbal. But before that capacity, at least be able to show them, how they feel. So that's validation. The second is venting. And in my lab, I'll have people come in. We'll take turns trying to dunk this red balloon in this big tub of water. And 100% of the time, that balloon pops up. Why? Because you can't outmath physics, right? But if you slowly deflate that balloon, the balloon will go down in the water. Well, if we don't express and vent how we feel, our emotions will pop up in our relationships. They'll pop up at school. They'll pop up in our health. That's why a lot of kids have tummy aches and headaches because they have these emotions that they don't know how to express. So they're very, very somatic. They're very like, oh, I'm sick. I need to stay home. So teach your children how to express how they feel. And some children, they don't want to talk about it. So many of my neurodivergent clients will just be coloring, I'll ask them to bring in their favorite characters or like, I'll look up their favorite characters, we'll print it out and we'll color together. We'll talk or express our emotions using, art. Others love to play with slime. So we'll like sculpt the emotions, however it feels authentic for your child. If your child cries a lot, rather than saying, stop crying, like say, crying makes you feel better. A lot of times when you tell a child that, they actually stop crying. It's when you say, stop crying, that they keep crying more, So teaching them how to express in healthy ways. A lot of autistic children, they stim a lot. They do a lot of soothing because, it's hard to express how they feel. So know that sometimes you can use those behaviors to get a sense as to what's happening internally, right? That's how they're venting. And then the third is values. So values is something that, depending on your child, depending on what they're into at that moment, sometimes children will be really, really into, a sport, or they'll be really, really into a cause. But, look for that joy. You want to make sure that when you are engaging in something like a cause or a sport or a hobby, something that brings you meaning and purpose, that it's bringing you meaning and purpose, and it's not just performative. It's not just serving the role, because that's where I think a lot of times it gets tricky. Like you said, like it looked great on the outside, but you knew when that spark was gone, right? And society's telling you, well, at least they're still performing, but when it's not bringing real joy and meaning. So pay attention to that. So that's the values portion. Don't discourage your children's values. You may not like it. You may think it's silly, but if they're passionate about something, take an interest in it. You may be like, I don't really like Pokemon. I think it's like boring and I think it's weird, but you sit with the child and learn, because there may be some element of that child is really resonating with, and it's exciting them and they look forward to it. So rather than push down that passion, like sit and learn. Curiosity is one of the greatest love languages. And then vitals, really important. So sleep with neurodivergent children should not be overlooked. And often it's the first sign that there's a decline happening. If your child's sleep is becoming erratic and they're waking up and they don't look like they're refreshed, talk to your pediatrician about it. Figure out if it's a tonsil issue. Figure out if they have sleep apnea. Maybe they're, drinking too much caffeine and you don't even know it. Or, something else is happening. Maybe they're having bad nightmares, or they're having really extreme anxiety. So address the sleep. It's important. Do not ignore sleep. Many times with autistic children, they have ADHD as well. And the ADHD medications may disrupt the sleep, right? But if you're not paying attention to their sleep, you don't know. So you're taking care of one issue. They're focusing better, or they're less impulsive, but their sleep is erratic. And the sleep being erratic is causing worse anxiety, right?
Right.
So really pay attention to sleep and practice sleep hygiene when you can. Teach children about keeping the room cool, keeping light at a minimum, staying off the devices, because that impairs their natural sleep cycle. But I think when you look at vitals, it's important. Vitals also includes diet. There are so many articles in the literature about nutritional psychiatry and how certain foods nourish your brain, allows your brain to produce more happy chemicals. So, but food is such an area of contention for kids who are autistic, because they can be very particular, right?
Texture.
And it becomes a big battle, so you talk to whoever it is, your pediatrician, about whether or not supplements are warranted. Sometimes they are, because your child's not getting the vitamins that they need. Or figure out ways that your child is okay with getting these vitamins into their body, these important nutrients, because the brain depends on this for healthy development, and also just for better sleep, better focus, better mood. If you have one of those children that eats veggies, great. But most children in general don't like veggies, so you have to figure it out and be creative with them. And there are also sensory issues around food for neurodivergent children, so be aware of that. You don't want food and eating to be a source of their trauma. I've seen it, and it's very difficult to address. Sometimes you have to work with an occupational therapist around food. There are certain feeding conditions that you really do need help with, and there are great creators who create content around feeding issues, but they do travel with autistic individuals, and be aware of that. Also within vitals is movement. And not every kid's going to like the same type of movement. Figure out what's right for your kid. Some kids don't like to move at all, but you just have to work with them. It could be going on a walk with them, walking with the dog, if that's the case, dancing, using sometimes the video games have like movement components of that, but movement is very, very important. And technology. Children who are autistic are very vulnerable to technology overuse. and they are targeted, unfortunately. So before giving your child a device, talk to their therapist, talk to their schools. There are organizations where they help parents to form a community. There's one called Wait Till 8th, where parents together will say, we're not going to give our child a device until the 8th grade because we know how habit forming it is. Have clear rules in the household around devices for everyone. So it's not just the children, it's the adults.
Yes.
Because, technology can be used for good, but it can also be very harmful. And it's easy to lose a child in that world. They stop being in the real world when they're addicted to technology. And connection. Children need friendships. They need real connection. And, autistic children are going to struggle more with that because of the emotional reciprocity that happens, right? See if you can find a community, like parents, don't be alone in it. If you can find, even if it's online, last resort, but it's better than nothing.
Yeah.
You really need friends, and loneliness is a problem for everyone.
Yeah.
So, try your best to support your child in those areas where they can connect to other children. And then the last V is vision. Like, how do you plan joy in the future so you don't get stuck in the past? So, celebrating your wins. So if your child is saying, I've done this and I'm no longer excited, we're going to celebrate anyway.
Yeah.
Get into the culture of celebrating wins and having things to look forward to as a family. With girls, what we found is preventative for suicide is having family dinners. Apparently, that's preventative for girls for suicide, and team sports, believe it or not. I was surprised by that finding because I was not a very good athlete, and I would be so anxious if I had to perform in gym.
Yeah.
But I found that, that interesting that, the team mentality is important for prevention.
Yeah.
So if that's your child, it may not be a sport like a soccer, but it could be a chess, it could be something else like Dungeons and Dragons, whatever it is that creates community and team, that tends to be protective, for youth suicide.
Yeah. That 5 V's framework is really powerful. It resonated with me on a personal level, just to sharing vulnerably, like the idea of naming the emotion. So when you spoke about, I feel like I heard men, but maybe I was hearing what I wanted to hear. Like we talked about like frustration could equal depression or sadness. And sometimes I feel like for me, like anger does, like I'll be in this exchange and I don't fancy myself. I don't believe like I'm an angry person, but sometimes I'm surprised in our interactions. Like I'm coming across angry and I'm thinking to myself, gosh, that's not really how I feel. But I've never thought to stop and say like, I don't know, I'm behaving this way, but I'm actually feeling this way.
Yes.
And I just found that really.
For men, it happens often because our society tells us that men they don't cry.
Yeah.
Boys don't cry.
Yeah.
But men and boys are sad just like girls are. Like sadness is a human emotion. But if you are raised to believe that, boys don't cry, then you're going to express anger because that's what you were taught. And that's why the education about validation and naming feelings appropriately is important, because when you realize, oh, I'm not angry, I'm expressing sadness or anxiety using an angry behavior.
Yeah.
Then you're like, well, what am I worried about? Oh, I was kind of worried about this one thing. So let me address the worry.
You mentioned women. Who else is getting missed? I mean, why are so many neurodivergent people, especially women and people of color, getting missed?
Well, we have this idea of what autism looks like. And I think a lot of it is the media.
The media,
the media can be great for educating, but also not so great because of these stereotypes, And when you think about the spectrum, right, you don't think about, for example, restricted kind of repetitive behaviors as being something that is, what you typically see in a regular teen, right? So if you see a child who's like memorizing all these like rap verses, right? Or really into fashion and collecting these magazines, you're like, oh, that's like typical teen behavior. Like you're not thinking that could possibly be related to an autistic individual because you're looking for the kid playing with like the trains
Mm-hmm.
and the Pokemon cards.
Yeah.
But knowing how culture impacts the way that you express certain symptoms is very, very crucial to making the correct, diagnosis, and not to label, but having the right diagnosis. It illuminates, right? You know what you're dealing with, right? You're like, oh my gosh, my child is having these challenges, and this is important. I should know that they're autistic because, autism can travel with ADHD and anxiety and depression and other learning conditions, seizures, right? Like it's important to know this. So not just to label, but to make sure people are getting the support they need. And girls often are, we get this pressure from society to be the good girl, to behave. So if you are getting this pressure from the outside that you're supposed to be a good girl, but you have these urges and you're suppressing and you're masking, then no one's going to know what you're dealing with because you're suppressing and masking, right? So a lot of times girls will be missed because we're looking for certain things. And we're not looking for, in general, the social reciprocity that could look very different in a girl versus a boy, a girl, not making eye contact and looking down. Well, she's just a graceful, shy girl, but it could be related to, the lack of reciprocity that you see, right?
Right.
ADHD is very, very common in autistic individuals. And many times you'll see hyperactivity. And that leads you to, well, let's do a diagnosis on this very hyperactive boy. And then you find out, oh, there's other things here. So you're seeing the hyperactivity from the ADHD led you to evaluate the child, which led you to then find out that there's other things, like maybe there's, autism there too. Versus a girl, her ADHD will not look like hyperactivity. It'll look like, or a running around the room as hyperactive, but her hyperactivity may be like this, twirling her hair or shaking her leg. But if you're trained to see that as, oh, she's probably just nervous, and you're not looking for ADHD in that girl because you see this as nerves, then you're going to miss that. And then that ADHD diagnosis would have led to maybe an autism diagnosis because you're doing a full evaluation. So that's where it gets a little tricky. And that's where girls will be missed many times. And then, if in your mind, autism is a white little boy, then if you see a Black child who is kind of restricted in their interests, then, and those interests don't look like what you would look for in, a white boy, then you're going to miss that diagnosis. You're going to say, oh, that's just a nerdy Black boy. Because Black kids are not supposed to be into these things, right? It's like, no, like autism can show up in Black children as well, right? Or Latina children and other ethnicities in different ways. A couple of years ago, I was working with a family, and they were Muslim, and the child had memorized the Quran, and they were like, "This child is going to be a religious genius." But the child was having a hard time making friends, and the child was having like all this hyperactivity, and I was like, "They may be a genius, but they're also autistic," and that's why they're having a hard time with certain like sensory issues, and like because they have sensory conditions on top of it, and then they're not making friends, so. But they were saying this child is going to be a religious scholar, and they may end up being a religious scholar, or in 2 years, they're no longer going to be into the Quran and going to be into something else. But if you're looking for certain things and you're not looking at the cultural lens, then you're going to miss out on supporting a child that needs it. So, yeah.
Doesn't really discriminate. It's, it's across everyone.
Yes. And everyone's different in their expressions.
So if a parent was maybe having an inclination that maybe my child is different or does have some kind of neurodiversity, would the first step be just to get an evaluation, like a psychiatric evaluation? Is that kind of how, that's what we did. That was kind of our first step, but is that what you would recommend?
Well, sometimes, and, usually by the time a child comes to me, there are problems happening, right? Sometimes children are okay and they're different, and that's fine. They're not having any extreme anxiety. They're not having depression. They're maybe have ADHD, but largely they're okay. They may not need anything other than acceptance and education about differences, right? But in many cases, the majority of the times, there's comorbid things happening. So if a child has a lot of anxiety, you want to get them support because it's very difficult to learn when you're anxious. You know, you're not going to be in class and like taking in that algebra when you're worried. You know, you need support there. And anxiety shows up in your body in so many different ways. With children, a lot of times they have GI issues. They're like constantly going to the bathroom. And knowing that anxiety can show up that way, you don't want to take that child to a GI doctor and then have them do all these invasive procedures, which is further traumatizing.
Right.
If you can just support them with the anxiety, you know? So yes, getting an evaluation can be very helpful because you may uncover other things. Maybe this anxiety is actually OCD that travels with autism, right? Or maybe they have ADHD, and ADHD is not something that, a child just grows out of it. ADHD untreated may lead to things like motor vehicle accidents because of the impulsivity. It may lead to problems in friendship because you're, not letting your friends talk. Broken bones, because of the hyperactivity. So ADHD is something that you want to get support for because there's such good treatments for ADHD. Depression, some children will need antidepressants and some people benefit from it. Others don't. Others need talk therapy. It's a huge misconception that autistic children don't want to be in talk therapy. Everyone needs to feel heard and seen, in however ways that is. It could be therapy, but some of my autistic clients really benefit from having someone to talk to. They feel better when they leave. So don't, deprive your child of that if that's something they could benefit from. And then neurology. Many times the learning issues are related to a child having seizures and you don't even know it. You just think, they're spacing out in class. You think it's ADHD, but it's actually they're having these silent seizures, So just be aware of all the things. Sometimes people have learning disabilities, so they'll need to have like some help in those areas. Occupational therapies because their fine motor skills aren't that great. Speech therapies, right? All of these things are supports. We're not trying to eradicate autism. We're trying to support a child who has challenges because that travels with an autistic individual.
I had one other thought. This has been so valuable and meaningful, and I know we're kind of coming to the end, but you had mentioned the lab earlier, and I think it's so intriguing, the work that you're doing there. And then before we started the interview, we were talking about the pressure that the teens are under to get good grades, to achieve, to succeed, to go to a good school. I mean, shoot, in California now for the UCs, there's so many people applying with meeting all the criteria that it's a lottery. So you could do all that work and not get into that school. Is there any work that you're doing about emotional burnout or burnout in general in the lab, or?
Well, right now our focus of research is on psychedelic research.
Oh, interesting. And
treatment-resistant depression, because the medications that are available, sometimes they're just not enough for some people. So we need to think about the brain differently. And I'm excited about this research because
me too.
We don't know everything. The brain is so complicated and so different than other organs. So psychedelic research looks at connecting the brain in ways that we didn't know were possible. Like it used to be thought that this part of the brain was depression, this part is anxiety, this part is this and that. We're learning that when people have severe depression, the connections are not there. The brain is not as connected. It's not communicating the way that it should be. And that the hope is that with psychedelics, we have more connection. And that connection is somewhat healing. It allows the brain to think differently. Whereas someone may be stuck in a rut and stuck in like a way of thinking, psychedelics possibly open up the brain to other ways of thinking. And so that's why people have these experiences at these facilities. They're not necessarily FDA control like mine because it's not like yet legal, but people leave the country and they have these experiences and they come back and they're like, I just think differently, So I am excited about that area. And in the other part of my lab, the happiness lab, it's not medication based. It's more about teaching people about the 5 E's and ways that they can use what they have in their surroundings to reclaim the joy in their lives. So that they can recognize anhedonia, that they recognize when they're just performing on the outside wearing this mask of pathological productivity, but they're really joyless on the inside, and ways to tap back into that joy.
It seems like it's so prevalent in our society, So thank you for coming up with a framework and some tools to help address that. Because I think so many of us need that.
Yes.
And what I'm really struck with, it maybe I see what I've always seen in like psychiatry, but like the number of times you've said we're learning or we're looking at, you're like looking at something differently. Like my experience has been, okay, I did all this schooling, now I have the shingle, the patient comes in, here's what I see and here's what we do. And you know, that might be really limited, but I'm just the exploration and learning that you're seeking to find optionality is just really powerful.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the research part of my brain. It's like we don't know everything. We're always exploring.
Yeah.
We shouldn't pretend that we do. And also, like, every person's so different. You know, one person with depression and first patient of the day depression looks so different than the second patient of the day with depression. So that's the individuality of it. Like, you know, you are the only person that will ever exist who is you. So you're special. You're here for a reason. So try to understand what it is about you. You know, what is draining your joy? What's taking away from your happiness? And when you understand that about you, then you know how to add back that joy to those areas of your life.
And I have this question, I have two questions. One I'm less sure on how to ask, but you said a few minutes ago about we need to research neurodiversity, autism, and suicide. I mean, yes. You're doing so many other great things. Like, have you thought about like what that might look like or even where to begin?
I think definitely working with families. There are institutes here in New York City that have large databases. And I think, you know, it's going to take a lot of interviewing with people, you know, talking to families, learning about the signs, but also funding. You know, it's an area, it's a sore spot right now. Research funds are being cut. And this is not the time to cut funds. We need to understand why children are becoming more suicidal. We need to understand why the number 2 cause of death in 10-year-olds is suicide. How did this happen? But we won't know if we don't have the research, if we're not talking to kids, if we're not talking to families, if we're not looking at data, if we're not looking at trends, if we're not talking with schools. All this requires funding and it requires resources. And we can't, this is not the time to get rid of those resources.
And then the last question I had that just came to me because I feel like there's so much inside of you that you know and we don't know. Like, if you were in our shoes, and what's one thing we didn't know to ask that might have been beneficial to ask you in this setting?
I think that there is nothing that you could do. Like, I think there's no way to know that, right? That's what I mean by that.
Yeah.
Like, there is no way to know what to do, because if you knew, you would have done it, right? You're dealing with the most painful thing a parent could deal with. And so if you knew, you would have done it. But what you do know now is that other parents need support. And so by you putting yourself out there and talking about it, that's huge.
Yeah.
You know, like, many parents in your shoes would not talk about it at all because of the shame. But what you're doing is decreasing that shame and that blame, and you're allowing people to talk about this and to get help and to prevent this from happening possibly to someone else. So if you knew, you would have done it.
Thank you. And then you're doing great work one-on-one with your patients and in the lab and traveling around for your book tour. I mean, what could we share with our audience about what you're up to, where they can find you, how they can engage more with you?
Well, you could follow me on my socials, Dr. Judith Joseph. And I think social media can be used to, you know, to share and to communicate. And so definitely don't do it alone. You know, reach out and find community.
Yeah, thanks so much for being here.
Yeah,
Thank you
it's
for
been an
having
honor
me.
to have you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. The honor's mine.
Appreciate you.
Thank you so much to Dr. Judith for her insight, compassion, and clarity on a topic that too often stays hidden in plain sight. If today's conversation sparked something in you, maybe recognition, maybe grief, maybe a new perspective, you're not alone. Masking, misdiagnosis, and high-functioning mental health challenges affect so many more people than we realize. We encourage you to check out Dr. Joseph's impactful work, especially her book, High Functioning, which dives deep into these issues with both clinical expertise and heartfelt advocacy. You can also follow her ongoing research and public conversations to stay connected with this vital dialogue. Whether you're someone who's felt invisible while seeming fine, or you love someone who might be silently struggling, we hope this episode gave you language, tools, and most of all, hope. If you or someone you know is in emotional distress, you can always text or call 988 for free and confidential support 24/7. To learn more and connect with a supportive community around masking, neurodiversity, and mental health, visit endurantmovement.org. There you can find ways to engage and support our important work. Together, we thrive. If this episode resonated with you, please share it with someone who might benefit. Help us build a culture where presence matters more than performance, and where neurodiversity is not just seen, but truly honored. We'll see you next time on The Endurant Show. Thank you for listening to The Endurant Show. If this conversation moved you, please follow us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. To view the conversations, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. And to be a part of the community, follow us at Endurant Movement. And lastly, if you feel called to support the movement and help us ensure no teen ever feels alone again, visit endurantmovement.org to learn more, and if you can, make a donation. Together we can create lasting change, one conversation, one connection at a time.